Welcome. So welcome to the CITRIS Research Exchange today. We are happy to welcome Victoria Coleman, and I'll give you an introduction in a moment. But my name is Jill Finlayson, and I'm the director of the Women in Tech Initiative here at CITRIS, and we are proud to co-sponsor this talk today. Over the past 10 years, we've had a remarkable lineup of technology innovators on this stage, and this is the final one for fall 2019, so good on you for being here today. We are looking at today talking about harnessing AI for global economic development. And so she's going to discuss a number of things around the technology and the vision behind her company, Atlas AI, as well as how they spun out from Stanford and a lot of even the ethics and issues around using this type of technology. So Victoria is our CEO of Atlas AI. It's a technology startup focused on social impact, generating actionable intelligence for agriculture and economic trends in the developing world. A native of Greece, Victoria has deep experience in consumer and enterprise technology and is a strong leader in strategy and development in software engineering, mobile platforms, connected devices, and cybersecurity. And a small shout out here, the next Women in Tech Symposium on March 6, 2020 is going to be on cybersecurity and look at a lot of these privacy, information security, and job opportunities in a massively growing sector. So a little shout out to save the date. She's been a longtime advocate of innovation in education and in the public sector. She serves on the advisory board for Santa Clara University Department of Computer Engineering and is a senior advisor here and director at CITRIS. She is a volunteer advisor with the United States Department of Defense Science Board and a member of the board of directors of the Public Library of Science. She has previously served as Chief Technology Officer of the Wikimedia Foundation, where she merged the foundation's technology needs from an infrastructure perspective with its mission and vision. She also has held senior leadership positions at Technicolor, Harman's Infotainment Division, Yahoo, HP Palm, Samsung's Advanced Institute of Technology, and Intel's Corporate Technology Group. So massive experience, great opportunity to ask your questions. But today, if you're interested in deep learning, satellite imagery, monitoring economic and agricultural trends on that hyper-local level, plot-level forecasts of smallholder crop yields, this is going to be a really exciting talk. Please join me in welcoming Victoria.
Hi. So thank you, Jill, for that wonderful introduction. Everything she said, about 10% is true, so don't believe everything you hear. But you did save the best for last. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for coming. I know there are lots of events going on campus at lunchtimes, even on kind of November days. So I appreciate your presence. I want to share some thoughts about our work at Atlas, but I want this to be really a conversation versus me just talking at you. So what I was saying is I want this to be a conversation versus just me kind of talking to you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our company, what are our aspirations about the work that we do, how we came to be. Hopefully there will be an opportunity to show you briefly our technology. I'll do a quick demo if Wi-Fi permits. And really just, stop me at any point. Questions that I can answer, I will, and those that I cannot, I will answer them later via my surrogates at the company. All right, so our company is all about geospatial analytics. It's about generating data insights from satellite imagery and other ground-based data. And why do we do that? Well, we do that with one purpose and one purpose only in mind, and that is to create transparency that is based on data when people make decisions that affect significant outcomes, in this case, in the continent of Africa. I spent the last 4 or 5 months raising capital for our company, and we're just about done with our A round. And I can tell you 9 out of 10 VCs ask the same question. They make the same observation, and that is that they know nothing about those markets. And unsurprisingly, if you know nothing about those markets, you're very unlikely to invest in them. So, Atlas has been sitting in this kind of chicken and egg situation for a long time, but it's interesting that, first of all, there are some VCs that look past the market and they look more at the technology, the opportunity. But also, if we really are successful at what we aim to do here, we will be creating the data that is needed in order to grow investment in a continent. And I just want to start with an example. So in May of this year, the African Continental Free Trade Area came into force. So leaders in Africa have for many years been working to get together to try to create the equivalent of a free trade zone within the continent, because that, of course, is one of the precursors of economic growth. And there was a cutoff. 23 countries had to join before it came into existence, and lo and behold, May 30th, that cutoff was met, and as of July 2020, that trading will start. So why did it take them so long to come to the conclusion that they should join this free trade area? I mean, it's almost a no-brainer. Well, what data do they have available to them in order to make sense of both what the impact would be to their own economies at joining, but also what the impact would be a year, 2 years, 5, 10 years down the line? And in truth, data is lacking to support leaders to make those decisions. And at the end of the day, it's got its determination, its leadership that drives people to join these organizations or otherwise. But we would like to move that to be a much more of a data kind of driven practice. I have a kind of another map here that I think is kind of interesting and also shows you to some extent why it is that in our company we chose to focus on Africa to start with. When you look at the map, we typically look at the United States and we look at Africa and we don't look at them like together. And you don't realize just how big Africa is. So, in this little map there, you see the size, in brown here, the United States, and you see China. This is a big place. If we make a difference there, we are really impacting outcomes for many, 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 many people. So we talked a little bit about the lack of data to support leaders to make data-driven decisions. And why is that? I mean, that's been the case for a long time. What tools do they have at their disposal? Survey data. You might say, well, survey data is how primarily they would do their work. And here's the state of the art when it comes to survey data in the continent. So this map here shows you the number of nationally representative surveys done in the decade between the year 2000 and the year 2010. And as you see, some areas have been very diligent in doing surveys. In other areas, there have been virtually none. So one of the problems that we have is, first of all, the frequency of the surveys is not what we need it to be. But even if we have surveys, oftentimes the results of these surveys are not consistent. So oftentimes the data that we get is very noisy, and here's an example of 3 data sources, 3 different surveys that actually give 3 different results. In this case, what you see is maize yield in Malawi in the year 2006-2007, and you see how much variability there is between what the country believes and what the FAO, in this case, believes. So we have significant kind of obstacles to overcome. It's not that people don't want to use data, it's just that data isn't available. And this is a problem. As Kofi Annan said, without good data, you're flying blind. And certainly, if you cannot see a problem, you cannot solve it. So, and here's like, for many of us that have been in the technology world for a long time, oftentimes technology is used for vile purposes, and AI, as all of you, I'm sure are aware, has the potential for being used for bad. But here's an opportunity for us to use it for good. So, our company is really focused at making, bringing with the best of AI to the development world, and thus building out, an AI for good capability that is truly meaningful and actionable. So, what is possible? Why is this possible now? Well, it really is because the whole discipline of Earth observation has changed. If you look at the growth of space missions, that Sentinel missions that are operated by the ESA, the European Space Agency, you see the incredible growth that is envisioned with the missions that are planned. So this is, of course, wonderful, and you also have third-party organizations like SpaceX really contributing on the number of missions. And overall, I think at the last count there were about 800 satellites that are doing that are dedicated to Earth observation. I mean, total there are about 5,000 circling the Earth. Most of them do communications work. But if you just focus on the ones that do Earth observation, we're talking about 800 birds, which is kind of interesting. One of the things that is kind of fascinating here is people have been really excited about the potential of microsats, for example, and the number of missions is growing. The problem is that there's this pipeline that is generating all this imagery, but we don't know what to do with it. So I remember those of you that watch 60 Minutes on Sunday afternoons. I remember hearing the outgoing chief of the NGA, the National Geospatial Agency, the spy satellite operators, saying that just for 3 of their satellites, they needed 6 million analysts to keep up with the imagery that they were producing. So we have this situation right now where a huge amount of investment has gone into putting these birds up there. They create the imagery, but understanding what the imagery is telling us is really the bottleneck. And that's where there is an opportunity, of course, for artificial intelligence to make a difference. And if you kind of superimpose back to the number of surveys that are being done today, as I was saying, they're very infrequent. If you look at the revisit rate of surveys via satellites, you see where disruption is coming, right? So there are places where even with satellites that go around the Earth, once every 24 hours. So you have a revisit rate of 24 hours. The mean is 1,000 days per household, as opposed to 10,000 days for traditional surveys. So this is like 27 years. That's the mean. So the opportunity of looking at outcomes at very regular intervals, even 24 hours, kind of visit scale is now within our grasp. The problem that we have is, what do we do with all this imagery? Great, we have it. Now what? Well, that's where AI can help and provide leverage. And when I say AI here, I'm just going to be specific for a moment. I don't mean Siri, and I don't mean NLP, and I don't mean information retrieval. What I mean is machine learning, in particular deep learning, and also simulation models that are complementary to those. So this is, in a nutshell, what Atlas AI is doing. We take satellite imagery, and we take training data that define ground truth. We train our models with with this data, and out of that we'll predict yields of crops, as well as economic indicators and other kind of quantities of interest, if you like, about the world around us. You may ask, where does this data come from? The satellite imagery that we use, that we've used in the company is now in, let's see, month almost 18th of its existence, has all been open source. So we have not paid a penny to buy satellite imagery. So it's routinely available. The magic comes in the ground truthing data, which of course, first of all, has to be georeferenced for us to be able to make any use of it. But also it has to be available. And as we already said at the beginning of this, this conversation, data is hard to come by in Africa. So one of the things that our founders have been doing for a long time, some of that work happened here in Berkeley, as well as Stanford, is to collect data from the ground and also build methods and methodologies for collecting data so that it's clean and can be used to train models. Also, over the years, and because of the prominence of the founders as professors, we've been able to collect data sets from organizations like the World Bank that would be really loath to give that data to anybody else. And they give it to us because they understand that our mission is around impact first and foremost. So if you do all this, what are the outcomes? So here's an example of the work that we do in agriculture, as Jill talked about earlier. This is a map that shows you agricultural productivity for maize at a 10-meter level resolution. So what you see in here is estimates that we've made for the amount, for the tonnage of maize that is produced at fields that can be as small as 10 square meters. The satellite imagery is at 10 meters. Our predictions here are at the 10-meter resolution. That's really cool because it not only kind of works well in the 10-meter kind of 10 square meter resolution level, but it also scales countrywide, which means that a government doesn't have to go around, physically kind of, counting the number of bushels that were produced in every farm. All they need to do is run a query on this data set, and we'll tell them exactly what it is. What is even more interesting in the case of maize, because maize for the last month of its growing season is not very susceptible to drought, you can actually forecast with very high accuracy a month before it's harvested what it's likely to be. So, one of the things that I tell people when I start talking about our work is I want to kind of move them away from thinking about a satellite as the primary kind of modality of interrogation being the image, right? So people do image recognition, and they do it really well. And actually, many of our kind of fellow travelers, if you like, in the space, some of them will call them competitors, do exactly that. They will count, for example, the number of cars in the parking lot. They will count the number of turbines that are present in the state of California. What they actually do is they do image recognition. Here, what we do is we look through the image to see things that are not visible really to the human eye or the naked eye, if you like. Right? So there's no way that by looking at an image you can tell, if a plot will yield, 2.5 tons per hectare, or whether it's going to be 4. But actually, AI can tell you that, which is really cool. This is what our data set looks like for economic outcomes. And again, I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what the product of the company is and what the product that we really make available is. We build data sets. We use obviously this kind of elaborate pipelines and so on to build them, but at the end of the day, that's the product. It's it's a data set, and in this case, what we do is we visualize it and we superimpose it on a base map. in this case of Ghana here on the right and Cote d'Ivoire on the left. And it's kind of interesting, and I'll show you this in a demo in a minute. Really data tells its own stories. If you were to look at this same map, without taking into account the change rate between economic outcomes between different areas, you will have a very different interpretation of who's doing well and who's doing badly in that area. Data allows you really to do, if you like, precision planning and precision evaluation about outcomes at a very detailed level. This data set here is produced at what we call it the village scale, which is 2 square kilometer resolution. The actual satellite imagery that we use is at 30 meters. So those of you that are familiar with satellite imagery will know that 30 meters is extremely low resolution imagery. In public forums, we know that 25 centimeters is really the kind of the state of the art today. So again, when you think about AI and its power, and let's kind of stop thinking about fake news for a moment, which is, by the way, all true. But these same technologies really can be used to create such incredible outcomes that can be helpful to people and economies. And we always need to kind of keep that in mind. And of course, we as technologists need to bring it upon ourselves to be clear about how the technologies that we use, that we develop, can be used or abused. And I know that's something that Jill here is thinking a lot about. And of course, there are also all sorts of very interesting kind of policy implications, technology policy implications that I'm sure many PhD theses will be written in the years to come. To move on, to show you yet another data set, this is showing you here our infrastructure assessment data set. So here what we are showing you is the presence of electricity in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, again, in the years 2014 to 2016. The really cool thing, of course, is that as well as looking at electricity, and you might say, well, electricity, you can figure out it's there if you look at the infrastructure. We also do the same thing for piped water, and piped water is not on the surface necessarily, as well as sewerage. So you can see really below ground. If the training data is good enough, the image of the image that you see on the satellite photo, if you like, is not a gating factor. So how does this work? Well, the way it works is if you have a decent set of training data sets, you determine what are proxy features for the things you want to measure, and then that's what we find in the satellite image itself. The cool thing is, because these are deep learning models, we don't pick out the features ourselves. The models do that. So the bottom line is really that now we can measure economic and as well as agricultural outcomes from space. And what that really means for the world of development is really the opportunity to do things very differently. So, all of you here remember the good old waterfall development. All of you, I don't know, maybe some of you remember that. I think Shankar and I remember that. Most of you, will have grown in the agile era, which hasn't really caught up with the development world just yet. So the way development works is that there's a lot of planning and design, there's the implementation phase, and then there's the evaluation phase. A typical program like this, the World Bank, for example, would be executing, would measure the beginning and the end of that process in years, in decades. It would easily be 10 years between the moment that you decided to plan and you implemented and being able to tell whether actually you've hit your target or otherwise. So why is that? Well, because they don't have data. Now that you have data, what it means is that you're actually able to go back and as the program is in execution, you can tell if you're hitting the right outcomes or otherwise. So it really, this transformation that is driven by data allows you to go from a kind of very old-fashioned kind of sequential way of creating outcomes to an agile discipline. And we all know in the world of software how that has changed the world. So just a few words now about Atlas. So Atlas AI was founded as it's a for-profit startup, but it's also a public benefit corporation. And it was started by 3 professors from Stanford. I'm going to tell you about them in a moment. And it was done so in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. And the express purpose was to bridge really the gap between academia and practice. Stanford has the Sustain Lab, which is where our founders have been doing their work for many years. They do incredible work. They educate lots of people. Here at Berkeley, there's, of course, the Blum Center. There is SIGA. There are organizations that are very impact-focused and are doing incredible technical work. But then how do you bridge the gap between that and impact? This is the reason why the Rockefeller Foundation decided to invest in the company, and note that they invested in the company. They didn't give us a grant. They made an investment because they believe, and we believe, that you can build sustainable business models in this space between academia and impact. It's a complicated way of setting up a business, especially again when you try to raise capital. It takes more than 2 sentences to describe to investors why this makes sense and how actually it can and does work. But we believe that we'll be creating here a data point that others can emulate. This is who we are, so that's me. George Azari is our CTO. He came out of Stanford and UC Irvine. We have a couple of very smart machine learning engineers, Anthony Perez and Gabe Karamura. And we're building out now our team with more machine learning people, with data scientists, as well as folks that will help us operate the company. And just parenthetically here, we are hiring. We love Cal. We love having people join us full-time. We love having people come work with us as interns. So if anybody's interested, you know where I live. I'd love to hear from you. To our founders, so David Lobel is a professor in net system science at Stanford, and he likes to remind us how brilliant he is, and proof of that, Genius Grant recipient from the MacArthur Foundation. Stefano Ermon is an assistant professor in computer science at Stanford. He's out of Cornell. Really bright kid. Top AI researcher under 35 in 2018. Makes my eyes water. Marshall, for a variety of reasons. Marshall Burke is an alum from Cal. He is a development economist, and he's the person that kind of helps us in many ways comprehend the kind of the macro impact, both of our work, but also of work that we would like to do in the future. As a computer scientist, I'm very kind of aware of, for us to make change in our chosen field, we have to be very focused in a very small area and know a lot about it. I mean, at some point, you know everything about nothing, but being able to understand in the impact space what the implications are of technologies and use cases that you build out on top of these data sets, that's something that honestly is way above my head. And I'm really glad that Marshall is there and is helping us understand those implications. We also have a bunch of great advisors, including Tamina Madden, who, again, Shankar knows very well. Tamina was here at Berkeley for about 10 years, working really to, I think she kind of more or less built SIGA from the ground up. With help from the academic side of the house. So we have a team that I'm honestly very proud of, and I'm even more proud of the kind of work that they do. So I just wanted to give you a few more examples before I launch into the demo. I talked a lot about Africa, but the work that that was done at Stanford and is being done at Stanford is much broader than that. So the founders have been focusing on emerging markets overall, including India. So one of the really kind of cool pieces of research that they published is, again, using satellites with very kind of low resolution, 10 to 30 meters, they can predict village population in sub-district levels with R-square of 0.93, which, as you know, is incredibly impressive. In fact, if I just kind of take a step back, our economic outcomes data set, the R-square is 0.7, which roughly means 70% of the time we get it right. And actually, when we do validation of that, we find that our outcomes are more accurate than if you were to go and do door-to-door surveys in all the households that we predict for. And why is that, you might say? Well, if you ask somebody, well, how much money did you spend on gas the last 6 months? They're going to give you an estimate, right? The kind of data that is used even in the surveys is not it's not itself reliable. So these methods are actually more reliable than the traditional ones, as well as much more easily accessible and achievable with technology. Here's a beautiful graphic showing you how you can, even at the kind of district level for consumption, you have an R-square of 0.71 for India. And just to do a bit more of a deep dive, you see one of the models here goes all the way up to 0.965, which is remarkable. Now for the last example that I want to show you, as Jill said, I spent a few years at the Wikimedia Foundation, and one of the things that I really enjoyed when I met the founders was this. So this is a map of the world that is built by looking at georeferenced Wikipedia articles. In other words, this thing here is built without a base map. So it just shows you where there are editors building knowledge and sharing knowledge and sharing the coordinates with the world. So why is this important? Well, first of all, it's very cool, and I love this map. But also because, as I was saying earlier, training data, and this training data is gold. So finding the right data sources, bringing them on board, cleaning them, and so on is really fundamental to this whole approach. Well, sometimes this data doesn't exist, so we have to make them. So here's an example of some work that was done at Stanford to actually create labeled data sets. So this is what a typical georeferenced article would look like. So this one is about the Nelson Mandela Bridge, I imagine somewhere in South Africa. You see here the coordinates, and there's a photo of it here. So with this, we're able to generate a very large set of what these images look like. And here is a bunch of images that were actually labeled with this data set. Now we can use this as training data when we go to do our infrastructure predictions. So if we have all this data, how do we use it? Well, for agricultural activity, there's a whole bunch of things we can do and we are doing now. It was very exciting this past summer. We worked with the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya to build the first ever food balance sheet for the country. One of the first questions that people will ask you, when you go and present there, is yes, this can work in a small field, but can it work at the country level? Because the government, first of all, it's a very political issue. There's a very sensitive issue. But also the government wants to be able to plan either to import grain or not. And in order to do that, you can't do that in a week, right? If you don't have this data in time, that's how you get famine, because it takes a lot of time to find the resource, to apply, to bring the crop in. This way, they have really a dashboard that tells them every week of the growing season where they're going to end up. So that's one possible way. Another way is to build agri-tech services. So today 33 million people in Africa are signed up for agricultural extension services that are delivered digitally over broadband. So we have, of course, an opportunity there to deliver enhanced services like that, and I can say more about that if anybody has any questions. We also use the data sets to build and deliver on-demand services in Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Togo. So now you see why we need people. So I'll show you where 2 machine learning engineers and to do all these countries. So anybody who wants to go and visit these countries, by the way, we can help you with that. The economic activity data set also is used, for example, in places like Ethiopia, where we worked with the World Bank to make a better poverty map. MNOs, mobile operators, use them to do revenue forecasting as well as planning for providing services, be it cell tower service or even things like where should you go put agents for mobile money services. Our data products, we started in agriculture with staples. Our plan is to move on and work on cash crops like tea and coffee, and then also tree crops. And that is consistent with the kind of the desire in the development world, in the development space, to move the conversation from hunger to nutrition, right? So today people aim at calorific content of foods for the continent. The aspiration, however, is to think more about nutritional balanced foods, and most of these foods will come from tree crops. So our roadmap is consistent with that kind of thinking in the development space. We also have roadmaps both in economic well-being as well as our infrastructure. So let me see. I don't want to spend too much time. Yes, this is my very last slide. This is roughly what our stack looks like. We're building a dataset factory, which then gets consumed through a dataset store, either through an API. And I would welcome many of you that are interested in using our datasets to connect with us. We will be opening up the API in the next month or so you'll be able to download and play with some of this data. We have a data browser that I'm about to show you, and then we will also ship with some kind of base prefab analytics so that people can interrogate the data set, and we will be producing also analyst reports, because some organizations, especially in Africa, don't have the competency, the technical competency inside, or capacity, if you like, to consume the data set. So for them, we need to put them in a digestible format. So as I finish here, if you allow me real quick, just to show you what this crazy thing looks like. Here's our data browser for the economic data set. So as I was saying earlier, the satellite imagery that we use to produce this is a 30-meter resolution. Our predictions are at the 2 square kilometer resolution. So every pixel here represents 2 square kilometers. And red roughly indicates relatively wealthier areas, and blue indicates poorer areas. So if we revisit now this space that I was showing you earlier, this is Ghana here, and this is Cote d'Ivoire. And just to give you a sense for the kind of the resolution of the data set, this is the highest resolution we get, and you see again where areas are people, where areas where people are affluent and areas where they're poor. When you see blanks like that, these are areas where there aren't enough people for us to make an estimate, and our population mass is 3 people per square kilometer. So the data set is here. So this was produced from 25,000 data points for the entire continent. And as you can imagine, there are many more than 25,000 households in Africa. So we did a great deal of out-of-sample predictions. So we had data for about 23 countries, and then we predicted for the rest of them. And as I was saying, the R squared is over 0.7. One of the cool things that I want to show you is the relative wealth change rate. And here's now this artifact I was showing you earlier. If you look at wealth as is today, or as it was in this case 2003 or 2006, or even if you look at it now, these data sets go back many years, you wouldn't see much difference between the two countries. But when you see at how things have actually changed there in the last decade or so, you see very starkly the result of civil strife and civil war in Cote d'Ivoire versus the incredible growth that Ghana has experienced. So again, these data sets allow us to have so much more visibility into what's going on in the world around us that hopefully also become really valuable tools for people. One of the kind of most unexpected kind of use cases for me, actually, I'm just going to share this with you real quick. These data sets tell so many stories, and we have no idea what all the stories are. But one of the things that happened, this past spring, if you remember, there was a cyclone in Mozambique that killed many people. Everybody was trying to figure out where villages were because the floods were so destructive that entire villages just disappeared. We work now closely with a company called Econet Wireless, which is headed by Stravik Masiyiwa. He's a really kind of forward-looking business leader in Africa, who also was the chair of AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa until this past September. So he was flying with helicopters, trying to bring as much kind of technology as possible to try and find where people might be. With his company, they were using, his company is Econet Wireless, it's an MNO, so they were using phone signals to be able to tell if somebody, was really using the phone or otherwise. It took them 24 hours to find the subscribers that were buried. In 24 hours, nobody lives. If they had access to this data set at the time, we can tell where villages are because there is economic activity. So we can tell you, if you go, if you don't see any village over there, and we know there was economic activity, something very bad has happened to the population, that's where you go. And note that this takes minutes to discover versus 24 hours. So the use cases for these data sets are really, yet to be discovered, and this is why, we look at them really as a platform versus, a product. I mean, we will make them available, and people will innovate and will build amazing things around them. And just to finish here, I want to show you what agriculture looks like. This is a very early version of our demo, and I only have here the data set for Kenya and Tanzania. The agriculture data set, because it's much more detailed and because growing conditions obviously depend on the geography and the weather of each country, are done on the country level. So here is Kenya. This is maize for Kenya. And again, just to give you a sense for the resolution and the accuracy that you're able to get with this kind of technology, I'm going to zoom in as much as I can. So here what you see is areas where there's been fairly poor harvest of maize, right next to areas that have done really well. You see the same phenomenon over here, you see it over here. And this, of course, is really interesting because none of this land is irrigated. In fact, only 4% of the land in Kenya is irrigated. So it's not weather that makes the difference here. The difference is practices, management practices, as well as inputs, fertilizers and seeds, cultivars. So, if you are the farmer that is farming this plot here and you see that your neighbors are doing so much better, now you know that you probably could do better yourself if only you did what they did. For example, by finding out what practices they used, when did they sow, how deeply did they sow, when do they fertilize, what do they use. It begins to become a tool where not only governments can have a big picture about whether they need to import corn or otherwise, but families can make their own kind of decisions that affect outcomes that can support their families or otherwise. We can very easily see, for example, somebody writing an app that can be used, and even on a feature phone that allows people to do monitoring of their own fields. Today, what's possible, and I said earlier that about 33 million people in Africa signed up for agri-tech services. What they do is they sign up for a crop. So, if this year you're growing tobacco, for example, and they do unfortunately grow tobacco in Zimbabwe, you're going to get notifications in general about the crop. With data sets like this, you're actually able to go and sign up to your own field and get forecasts as well as monitoring for your own crop. So it's a very, very different set of capabilities that can be made available to people. I'm going to stop there. I think I've went way over my time. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you for this amazing.
Thank you.
What an amazing invitation to discover new use cases, to discover new data stories, to use this API. I think we have time for one or two questions, and then I would invite you to come up afterwards. Yeah.
Hi, I have two quick questions. The first one is, you're basically looking at satellite data. This is a very powerful platform. Can it be used from bottom up and used effectively, taking ArcGIS, geospatial mapping, and other data sources to integrate into your system? And my second question is, there's a lot of opportunities from a business model standpoint in terms of doing predictive analysis for crop harvest, et cetera. But also there's going to be 200 low-hanging satellites in the air above the Earth within the next 5 years. How does your platform integrate with this huge increase in satellite data?
These are both great questions. And so to your first question, we haven't done this yet, but it's entirely possible to integrate different image modalities. So the advantage, of course, of a satellite image is that it covers a very large area. At the same time, you can use drones that cover a much smaller area, but of course they're much more accurate. And it's entirely possible to do fusion of these data sets. In fact, our thinking is to use drone data to collect training data, georeferenced training data for tree crops. Because, for example, being able to count the number of coffee beans on a coffee tree under a canopy, under cloud cover, it's a very challenging proposition if you just have access to satellite imagery. So merging these modalities is something that, for example, UNICEF, and the UNICEF's lab in New York has already started working on, and that's something that we will be doing as well. Now, to your point, this is precisely why I think the company is solving an important problem. With 200 satellites, again, the amount of imagery that will be available, it will be overabundant. That's not going to be the problem. Can you ingest it, and can you make something out of it? One of the things that we will be doing is beginning to experiment with much higher resolution imagery. I imagine that we will have to tune our pipeline not to be overwhelmed by that. One of the questions that we don't have answers to actually right now is how much better you're going to get. So our crop maps are at 0.55 right now, R-square, which is, it's not, it's great because the next kind of best is 0.2, but it's not good enough, for example, to do insurance payouts. If you're going to build, crop insurance triggers, 0.55 is not good enough. Now, if I had, for example, 25 centimeter resolution data, would that help us get to 0.65? We don't know yet. This is work that we need to do. So while we will definitely be using high resolution data, we're also going to make sure that we use we don't kind of block our pipelines with too much data if it doesn't affect the outcomes. So this is why this is so exciting, and this is why our success is really kind of gated not only in what we do in the company, but also what our academic brethren are doing in the labs, right? So the company is a wonderful way of, grabbing these problems that we hear from, for example, the crop insurance world and pushing them back to the lab, where people actually can go and take risk, investigate and take risk out of the technology before we implement it.
So I'm curious how you got African country leaders to buy into your research, and also if you are training the African people, or you're bringing American companies in to do this work. Yeah. That's my idea.
It's a great question, and we are very thoughtful about creating capacity locally in those nations to be there and to continue the work after we're long gone. But it's not nearly as simple as that. Who trusts data if it's data that another country brings and makes available to your leaders? Would you trust that? We don't, right? I mean, even if it's available to us. So one of the things that we do is we work with local people, both to collect and curate the data, and then as we operate kind of the data factory, as we create, for example, forecasts on a weekly basis, we work with local companies that are able to fact check, first of all, but also really to be the custodians of the data that we create. We also make a point of using honestly local data centers. So our partner Econet Wireless also has a company that operates data sets and has fiber all the way across Africa. That's what we use for storing data, because it should not leave the continent, first of all, but to your point, this only makes a difference, and it only scales if local people can take advantage of the technology and operate it, as well as frankly contribute to its creation. So the first time I went to Nairobi, I was flabbergasted. In Palo Alto, and here in Berkeley, we're very fortunate. There's a lot of talent, and we tend to think that the rest of the world doesn't. And you go to Nairobi. I went for coffee with like 18 incredible machine learning people that I could hire every single one of them. So there is so much competency also that's been built on the ground. So I think this is why, getting all these threads together now at this time actually stand a chance of making a big difference. Right?
One more round of applause for Victoria, and thank you for joining at the CITRIS Research Exchange.